I want to ask that because, so how did you become a CEO at age 16?
Well,
Bonnie Chiu is an accomplished social entrepreneur, gender equality advocate, and a leading figure in the world of impact investing consultancy. She is the managing director of the Social Investment Consultancy, where her clients include UNICEF, Save the Children, and the British Council. Committed to promoting gender equality, Bonnie co-founded Lensational, a social enterprise that empowers marginalised women through photography and storytelling training, which has impacted over 1,000 women across 23 countries. Bonnie is one of our modern social justice warriors. Her work in empowering marginalised women, fostering gender equality, and creating positive societal change leaves an enduring mark on communities around the globe. Let's learn.
your whole person is formed before you turn 18. And which is why I still feel very passionate about young people discovering as much as they can their own passions and being able to freely develop themselves at a young age, because those were the formative years. But I did feel, because I had that experience at 16, that then at 20, when I was determined to start my own social enterprise, I didn't feel too scared. I mean, I still felt scared, but I felt, oh, I can do it. Even though there were so many older adults that were telling me not to.
Okay. Bonnie, thank you so much for coming to the School of Social Justice. I'm really happy to have you taking the seat to share your wisdom and experience, particularly as someone who I've known over the years and have gained a lot of value from our conversations and learned so much from your experience and your work. There was a time when my team and myself sat down with you and you shared with us ways of how to evaluate and create impact to ensure we're really making a difference. And I think there's a lot we can learn from you in terms of the work you do with organizations like ours, but also so many organizations that you work with. But also as you as a leader of people and someone who looks at social justice issues, not only from a kind of professional perspective, but also given some of the things we talked about personally as well. So I can't wait to hear from you. So welcome to the school.
Thank you. Thank you.
First off, please tell us a bit about yourself and kind of what you're up to now.
Yeah, so the topic of social justice, I think, is very dear to my heart, both, as you said, personally and professionally. I think starting off with professional, because that's easier to talk about. Majority of my time now, I run and lead a social impact consulting company. So we work with organizations, whether that's foundation or frontline organization, who are creating social change, and we support them to really amplify their impact. So help them understand where they're creating social impact, how can they do it better, and also look at different financing mechanisms to make that happen, not just relying on grants, but let's think about social enterprise model or repayable finance, blended finance to make that happen. So I now have a team of over 20 globally. In the UK, of course, where we're having this conversation, but also across Hong Kong, where I'm from, and in Ghana, in the Middle East, and in the Bahamas. So it's becoming like a global network of experts who are advising on social impact. So that's more professionally. And I came into this work as a social entrepreneur. I started my own social enterprise focused on women's empowerment. And very soon into that, I realized there's so many fundamental issues with the funding system that I needed to work with those decision makers in order to create systems change. So that's just a quick overview on kind of professionally. And our focus, how we view social impact is deeply interwoven with the idea of equity and justice. Oftentimes we find that organizations think, because we are doing social impact, then it's by default we're reaching the most marginalized, that we're being inclusive. But actually, it's not true. Like it's often a blind spot for many organizations. So we also advise organizations on how they can embed equity and justice into their funding strategy, into their program strategy. And on a personal level, I shared with you a while back. I became a mother around 1.5 years ago. So that is taking up a lot of my time because we don't have family around. So there's a bit of me being a parent as well that I'm thinking a lot about how can I raise my daughter in a way where I know the cards are kind of stacked against her. And I think that is quite a big cloud, I think, over a lot of parents, both from a climate perspective, the world that she's being brought into, but also as a girl, as a mixed race kid in London, in the UK. So yeah, there's a lot of kind of deeper issues that I'm thinking about. But of course, I'm also a daughter. I'm the only child in my family, and even though my family is in Hong Kong, I still just connect with them a lot, and I feel very strongly that you never finish being a child either, because and in our culture we have a lot of responsibilities to our elders as well. So yeah, that's kind of what's keeping me busy.
Amazing. Very busy as always. And there's so much there that I can't wait to discuss with you in more depth over this conversation and this hour. You kind of mentioned the kind of your definition of social justice, mixed between your now role as a leader of an organization which is international, plus you being a leader within your household and your home, raising your new child and your baby. Could you go in a bit more as to what you mean by social justice, particularly the equity and justice bit? Like, what does that practically look like when it's reality?
Yeah. I'm a very visual person, so I often think of actually what the pictures of social justice would look like. And I remember when I was around 10,
Okay.
9 or 10, so 2003, it was a year of quite a lot of transformation in Hong Kong, because that was a year when 500,000 people went on the streets to protest. In our tradition, sadly, which has dissipated now with the kind of clampdown on civil rights, but usually on 1st of July, which is also the handover anniversary of Hong Kong back to China, that is the day when people go and protest. So it became like a thing since 1997. But 2003 was that year when so many people went out on the streets. And I remember I was 10, my parents dragged me along. It was so hot.
Yeah.
It was 1st of July in Hong Kong. It was just boiling. And I was like, why am I here? So many people. And in the end, I think my aunt and I went to the library because we just couldn't stand the heat.
Sweltering heat.
Yeah, while my parents continue.
Okay.
But I think for me, social justice is the ability to go and fight for what you believe in. And unfortunately, in many places, because of systemic forces beyond our control, people don't have that freedom to go out and just fight for what they believe in. But yeah, that for me is kind of visualization of social justice, first and foremost. But then there's so many layers as well, because I could go out to protest. And actually, if I was in maybe other countries as a young girl, I couldn't just go out, right? So there's you need to think about gender. And then in a lot of countries, also, if you are of a certain color, if you have certain characteristic, you going out in protest means, well, you might have very dangerous consequences. We know from George Floyd and all the things that are happening in America. So I think as I kind of grow older, I think about social justice very much from the perspective of gender, race, and the characteristics that we individually have that make us so beautiful as a human race. But unfortunately, because of all the centuries of oppression, some groups are not being able to realize fully their potential and their human rights. And another strand interwoven in that is more invisible
Mm.
barriers that segment our society. And I think reflecting on where I grew up, it's really this question of class and socioeconomic
Okay.
backgrounds. I think um, the fact that my parents brought me out to protest um, is probably because, well, on weekends they don't have to work, they don't have to worry as much as other families in kind of more working class backgrounds about putting food on the table, right? So there's this component of class, and Hong Kong is one of the most unaffordable cities in the world, and it is so hyper capitalist. And growing up, I think I was very alive to these issues of market forces. You just open the newspaper and you see, okay, house prices go up by 5%, drop by 10%. People in dinner table discussions would be talking about property prices, investments, and yeah, you kind of grow up thinking about it, and then that is also why I ended up studying business. But
Okay.
it's during the study that I realized, well, actually, business up to this point has actually caused a lot of the issues that we see in the world, and me then realizing, yeah, there's got to be a different way, and leading to social enterprise. But yeah, I think social justice really comes down to freedom and this realization of all of us as fully flourishing individuals in the world of systemic inequalities.
Very in-depth kind of summary of the issues that you care about, and also a very particular, actually, definition of social justice in regards to, being able to fight for what you believe in. I mean, I'd love to go into the methods of which you'd use to fight for what you believe in a bit, just in terms of your work running this organization, but also, kind of in your multiple initiatives that you've contributed to over the years. But just before that, I'm very curious about kind of this bit about you personally, because I haven't really had this discussion with other guests on this series so far. You are, uh, correct me if I'm wrong, you're an immigrant, ethnic minority woman in London who leads an organization now of 20 staff. Um, and you're now raising a child. Now, there's a lot of people who might not have had the opportunities to have parents who are active, who understand or talk about politics or activism around the dinner table. My parents are of working class background. My mum was she came to this country to work as a chambermaid cleaning hotels in the Lake District, and worked as a croupier within the casino industry. My dad was a waiter before he passed away when I was young. And so we didn't really have those conversations. And often my mum was, leaving me and my sister at home while she was working late shifts. Um, what do you say to like those young people out there who might not necessarily have the opportunity to have those kinds of conversations at home, but are looking for ways to get involved or to learn outside of maybe the destiny that's set to them to not get involved? Do you have any kind of
Yeah.
advice, particularly now as a new mother?
Yes. Um, I think my parents did bring me to protest, but to be fair, we didn't talk much about those social issues at home.
Okay.
But I think it must be that awakening when I went to protest, and around that time and other exposure at school, I remember I was just really bored, and then because I'm the only child,
Okay.
and I was raised by my grandmother who's amazing, but she loves watching TV all the time, so I have to find things to do myself. And I remember spending a lot of time in the library, really.
Okay.
And
So you're always reading from a young
yeah,
age.
reading. And I remember reading Gandhi. I mean, it sounds so cheesy, but I did read
Nice.
the autobiography of Gandhi. And I think that was very insightful for a 12-year-old.
12 years old
Yeah.
reading. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes. I think there's a bit of, well, let's seek out knowledge. And
But
it's
what
hard.
compelled you at 12 to read Gandhi? That, I mean,
I, I was so
that's,
bored.
oh, wow.
I think what compelled me, um, I don't know. It was just,
Hmm.
I don't remember the thought leading to
Yeah.
me wanting to read Gandhi, but I think I was exposed to a lot of books as at a young age. I think the greatest thing that my father did was consistently trying to bring me to a library. So I'm every weekend. So I'm excited by the possibility to uncover things through books. I remember the childhood series that I love reading was the Magic Tree House series. I don't know if
Yeah,
you
Magic Treehouse. I think the
basically it's
Magic
a
School Bus. I remember the Magic School Bus, but okay.
yeah, well, there might be some cultural difference because I grew up in Hong Kong, but
Mm-hmm.
the Magic Tree House is a series where there's a brother and a sister, and
Okay.
they have this tree house built by them, by their father, and there's a library, but within the tree house is possessed by magic. So basically, you
Okay.
open a book and then you get transposed to that particular
Okay.
place. So
Interesting.
each book is about Egypt
Hmm.
or go back to the dinosaur age and
Hmm.
like something completely different.
Hmm.
And I think I was so kind of encapsulated by that series and by the idea of adventure.
Hmm.
And then I just got really into reading books.
Oh,
So I was just, yeah,
hmm.
kind of sourcing a bit like AI would do now. Just
Yeah.
looking out for knowledge wherever you can
I mean,
find
but I
it.
love that though, kind of just the weekly visits to a library and kind of I couldn't put it in as good of a word or sentence as you did, but kind of this want for finding out the unknown and discovering that's such a kind of really important in a way philosophy to live life by is that curiosity and willingness to learn, I guess. And that was
Yeah.
something that you developed, 12 years old reading Gandhi, which is amazing. And as you know, the mission of the School of Social Justice to train the next generation of Martin Luther Kings, but not only Martin Luther King, your Gandhis, your Greta Thunbergs, your Malalas, and many people who are not necessarily
Mm.
known who have done the organizing and campaigning behind the scenes. Um, Fascinating that Gandhi was one of your early kind of inspirations. But yeah, you could, would you share more about that as well?
Yeah, I think for young people it's so easy to just follow what your friends do. And I think
Okay.
there was a bit of me that perhaps because I wasn't so popular in school, I was a bit
Mm,
nerdy.
mm,
So then I was just like, okay, doesn't matter. Let me just be in my world and kind of read. And I found a lot of joy and pleasure from just reading and from one book led to another. And
mm.
I think that really broadened my horizons. And then,
Just
yeah,
on that, because I think that's a really important point to share where so much of the fight to achieve social justice is often seen as a social activity. Of course it is, right? Organizing with people, building coalitions,
mhm,
giving public talks in order to arouse people to take action. But actually, within that, there's also a very strong need for solitude and, almost self-reflection and hard work alone in a way.
mhm.
And I think just imagining you reading all these books in the libraries, I mean, that's the kind of work also that's necessary as a method for achieving social justice. Take time to develop yourself, basically. I mean, is
Yeah.
that something that's held true for you throughout your career?
I think so because you need something that grounds you. You need
Mm,
to really understand what are your values, what you're passionate about, what will keep you up at night.
mm,
Because then the actions follow. It's about finding your why and then the
okay.
what will just follow. I do see it in children's books these days though.
Mm,
Of course, I'm kind of procuring different books for my child.
mm,
And there are lots of books now about role models of
yeah.
like women of color.
Mm,
There's a series that I was featured in called Rebel
mm.
Girls.
I
It's
think I
a,
saw it. I remember going to find a book for my niece, Alexi. She's 5.5 years old. And there's the kind of the series of all the little heroes. But then I remember being in a bookstore, and I think I remember seeing your name. I was like,
yeah,
"That's so cool." I was like,
yes,
"I know them." Yeah.
yes. Yeah. So, it's great to have those series which are really challenging stereotypes. And I think
Mm,
instilling in like really young children, a sense of purpose and inspiration. I even came across this book, which I might buy a bit later, but
mm,
it's about how do you talk about racism with your child.
mm,
Um, so, so yes, I think books are huge source of knowledge.
mm,
And particularly important because it helps us uncover our why. And then I think later on in school, I then became quite active in volunteering.
Okay.
We can move more onto that. But I think without the early inspiration, I probably wouldn't have decided on volunteering, or I would just have followed whatever my friends were doing.
There's two things there which I'd love to discuss a bit more, which is first off, I mean, well, in a bit the volunteering side, but also kind of the race aspect, because I've had a career where I've been fortunate to work really interesting jobs which have, played a part in addressing some social issues like poverty, criminal justice, racism, and so forth. And within the field, because we were in England, sometimes there's a very strong lack of diversity and a very uh, seeable, visible lack of diversity at leadership levels. Now, you kind of alluded to some of the challenges you face, but you as a leader of colour, I mean, what is your experience of racism within the sector of social justice? Because I think we can think of ourselves as almost immune to it, but my honest and kind of own experience is that when I looked around, when I started off my career in the non-profit world, it was like, nobody here is like me. And because nobody was here was like me, or from ends, or from plaster, or from immigrant working class backgrounds, I felt like nobody could understand me, and therefore maybe there was a lack of trust. And there's all these kinds of issues which came up in that career. For people of colour, young people of colour, or people who want to get involved, who might not necessarily be part of the majority. I mean, can you share a bit of your story and your perception of that within our sector?
Yeah. I started out as a social entrepreneur when I was 20. And actually before that, I was quite fortunate to be in a student entrepreneurship program.
Okay.
So I was 16. And, still in school, and we just had to create this student company. And then you actually had to create a product. You had to go to trade fairs and sell and make actual money.
How old are you then, sorry?
16.
16, and you were basically it's like an
it was an entrepreneurship program. So, but I think that enabled me to realize, oh, you're young, but actually you can really make real money. Like we had to raise funds from our friends, family, as startup capital. Then we had to procure the product from China, negotiate with factories. So, it's like this real thing. I was the CEO, and we had a team of 16. And, there's marketing department.
Wait, I want to ask that because, so how did you become the CEO at age 16? Because I think I asked this question. Actually, I won't say why I'm asking the question, but I'm curious first off.
Well, it was a bit circumstances. I think I was already in different leadership positions in school.
Okay.
And then you had this moment where the teacher advisor said, okay, now we need to divide up who's doing what. So is anyone interested to be CEO? And because I was already in leadership positions, and I basically didn't need to study as much as other people because I had like a different way of going to university. So that's like a very specific circumstance where I basically had more time. Okay. So I thought I can just be. So I raised my hand, and there was another one who raised her hand.
Wow.
And so we had to pitch. But, so it was a bit awkward, but anyway, we got on and people voted.
Oh, people voted.
Yeah.
Okay.
So she was deputy CEO and I was CEO.
Well, I say that because at the age of 16, you're already vying for leadership positions amongst the peers. I read somewhere, and I need to find a source, but with the nativity plays that you have often in kind of school or primary school, or even kindergarten, the person who plays Joseph or Jesus, supposedly, I can't remember if this is scientifically proven, but they often go on to do leadership roles. And it's interesting how the roles we play or are chosen to play when we're young can be so instrumental in how we perceive ourselves in the world. You were 16, you were the CEO, you beat the other person to this role, and then now you're CEO of your company. And I mean, I just find that kind of fascinating, that so much of your journey was shaped at such a young age.
Yes, it really is. And I think for me, it got shaped a bit later. I think I was always very good in school, which gives you that validation. And I think a lot of different people get that validation elsewhere, maybe athletics, music, but you do need this sense of validation because that builds your confidence. But I think it was really one teacher who reached out to me and asked me to apply for like different extracurricular activities, which then made me think, oh, I didn't see myself as a leader. It was all like leadership programs. So I think that helped.
So the key of
And then,
adults to kind of encourage people to get involved.
And sometimes it's parents, right, who really encourage their child to take that extra step. I come back to always this idea of going out of your comfort zone.
Okay.
And
what does that mean to you?
Well, to do something you're uncomfortable. You know, it wasn't comfortable for me to necessarily be a CEO. Like it wasn't, but I felt, oh, I could learn something or I could challenge myself. So that was kind of what motivated me to be that CEO. And I think it was a great experience because, I still feel very proud of that company. And I still actually go back. I mean, now I'm double that age almost. But I still go back to that annual report I wrote for that company, in my own philosophy now as a leader, because I wrote this whole section on culture within that report. And sometimes I look back, I'm like, I was so smart. I'm no longer this smart, but I peaked at 16.
Yeah.
But I was writing about, because the product was a coffee mug, basically.
Okay. Yeah.
So I made this metaphor of a coffee, like how do you make a great cup of coffee? And so I made this analogy. Our product department is like the coffee, the ground coffee. And I, as the CEO, is like the water, bringing all the ingredients together.
Okay.
And the finance is the sugar, but you know, you shouldn't give too much sugar. It's just the right amount to measure. So anyway, I made this analogy, and I find it really interesting that 2 weeks ago I was looking back at that report because I'm trying to reflect on how do I build a great team culture as my team is expanding. So yes, early, I feel your whole person is formed before you turn 18. And which is why I still feel very passionate about young people discovering as much as they can their own passions and being able to freely develop themselves at a young age, because those were the formative years. But I did feel, because I had that experience at 16, that then at 20, when I was determined to start my own social enterprise, I didn't feel too scared. I mean, I still felt scared, but I felt, oh, I can do it. Even though there were so many older adults that were telling me not to.
Okay. Go on. So there were people saying, don't do what you want to do. I mean, what were they saying?
Well, I was in university. I was studying business. We talked about that earlier. And I got really fascinated by social enterprise. And with a few kind of colleagues, we brainstormed, what can we do? And then we came up with this idea of empowering women through photography. So equipping marginalized women and girls, particularly in developing countries, through a camera so they have a voice and a space of strength, and that they can make money as well. But my classmates kind of fizzle out because they were like, oh, it's just an idea. But I felt very strongly, let's go and really make this happen. So we were part of a competition, almost won the prize, but didn't end up doing. And there was a judge who said to me, I don't remember where my colleagues were, but who said to me in particular, you're very bright young women, but don't waste your time on this. Just go find a job. Because I was like three months away from graduating. And that was like a few days before International Women's Day 2013. So, really 10 years ago. And I think his work really damaged my confidence. But then on International Women's Day, on that day, I was like on Facebook and I saw a lot of inspiring stories of
Mm.
women doing things, not just women, anyone working on gender equality. And I just felt, well, let me try and do something. Like, I
Amazing.
don't want to hold myself back. So I just started a Facebook page on that day.
Amazing.
And it just kind of grew from there. But I think if I didn't have that earlier validation experience as a CEO, I probably would just have let the judges' feedback get into me, because it's scary, right? To say, in a way, to refute the feedback from a older person, which in my culture we take for gold.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think there's so many lessons there, particularly around the need for spaces to kind of learn and to almost like a sandbox when you're young, to be able to fail and to not have much pressure as you might do later on in your career, because it allows you to have the confidence to say, I've done it before and I can do it again. There's also the lesson there of really listening to your heart and what you want to do. Listening to people, of course, but then in the end, recognizing that the decisions you make are going to impact your life, and this is your life, and you know, no matter what other people say, your choices are your choices. And I think then it reflects on the other side, where we also have to be very aware of our influence on other people, where we might not see it, but sometimes us trying to project onto others what we think they should do could be the worst thing, because actually they might go on to do something which is just out of our imagination. So I think particularly for people who may be watching and listening, who are in a position of influence, being very aware of kind of maybe unwillingly setting up boundaries for someone who could just go on to do amazing stuff. I kind of want to talk a bit more about the methods that you've employed, particularly around business and entrepreneurship and kind of leadership of an organization. Just before I do, I just want to ask one final thing. If you do have any comments on race within our industry, like
Yeah.
any final thoughts on that before we go into
Yes.
methods?
So I didn't touch upon that. I started with youth because originally that was my limiting factor, feeling that, oh, as a young person, I couldn't achieve something, which I think maybe a lot of people watching would also feel the same way. But it was a year after I started or actually 6 months after I started my social enterprise, I moved to the UK because I felt there's much more room to grow the organization. There's much more flourishing ecosystem. Anyway, I moved to the UK, and I think that's when I confronted the issue of race for the first time. When I was in Hong
From
Kong,
Hong Kong to London, yeah?
in Hong Kong, I was the benefiter, like I was the race that was superior, so to speak. So I knew the issues of ethnic minorities, but it was more as a campaigner trying to fight for rights of ethnic minorities in Hong Kong, but not lived experience. And when I came over, that's when I started, realizing all these issues. And it took me a while to have that language to describe what I was feeling. I think it really took like 5 years for me to say, yes, this is kind of racism, and yes, we have a lack of representation in the sector. And I've gone on to try to champion. But, meeting people like you early on in my London days helped, because I feel, that people look kind of like me.
Yeah.
Who
That's
are,
so sweet of you to say that.
who are also young and who are considered as leaders and fighting for these things, or having unconventional career paths, not work in a big company. So I think having peer role models really helped when you don't have those role models in the establishment.
That's really interesting. So in a way, like, this is the first generation who's really pushing, because the previous generation didn't have the opportunity. I often think about that. I'm like, as I say, son of first generation people who came here, and now the first generation of people born and raised in England. This is different challenges, and we're starting from a very different position from, of course, people who've been here for generations. And for you coming age 20, I mean, like, the challenges, of course, are that which face immigrants whenever they move to another place. And I think you are testament to what can be possible if you are able to break those barriers. Let's talk a bit about what work you're doing now then, and particularly on business and running. I mean, how does your business and organization seek to address social justice issues right now?
Well, I started to work in the consultancy because I felt, as a social entrepreneur tackling this particular issue, I was so hamstrung by the funding system. So a lot of funding is not going to young social entrepreneurs, not going to entrepreneurs with lived experience, but to established organizations with proof of concept, etc. So I think part of the motivation to work in a consultancy is, well, can I actually be in a position to change funders' behaviors so that more funding would ultimately go to the next generation of entrepreneurs who might be in a similar position as they found themselves in, like I was. So that is kind of one way of trying to create change.
Why do you think there is that lack of distribution of funds to particularly ethnic minorities or underrepresented groups? From what you've seen, like what are the facts? What is your own experience of why it isn't being distributed equitably?
Yeah, the statistics are a bit daunting. When you look at venture capital funding, I always lose track. And I actually try not to remember the statistics too much because it just drags you down, whether it's 1 or 2% of funding or 99% of funding going to all white teams. I mean, the list goes on. I do think systemically, people who get funding are the ones who have had the most track record in the shortest amount of time. And that often would be white men who have had the best education from a certain segment of society. So I do think, this concept of merit is a bit rigged because those who have merit are those who are on a different starting point. So there's that very concrete things on who has the most experience when you're presented in front of investors.
But also, there's experience, sure, but there's so many people with talent. And also there's the bit there about trust and relationships, right? Like, yes. The fact that the family member knows the family member.
Yes.
It might not be directly nepotistic, but within that community, that person might have gone to the same university or went to the same golf club this of course has been talked about a lot within popular media, but within my experience, that the ability to be able to trust is such a core part. And I guess it is easier to trust someone who might be like you. And therefore, if the funder is of a particular background, of course, they're more likely to fund a particular background. And that is evidenced by the research. But I think what is really interesting now is seeing the funding space change, where you have funders who are of diverse backgrounds, particularly after, as you mentioned, George Floyd, the summer where George Floyd was murdered. We've seen, of course, the Black Lives Matter movement completely shift the needle on all of these issues related to race and internal transformations. It is looking, well, I was going to say really positive, but better, shall I say, with all the commitments. But I mean, that bit there about race within the money and funding thing is really, that's a huge topic in itself, and we can speak about that for days. But I'm curious to know where you think it is right now.
I think it's moving in the right direction for sure. So I've been supporting in the past few years a lot of funders who are committing themselves to be anti-racist, therefore requiring an examination of their funding processes, funding strategies, so that they can be channeling more funding to people of color. So that's definitely happening. But I was reflecting on this yesterday, that actually the actions are also drying up a little bit. Like, really? And I was telling my husband, and he's like, "What already?" Like, it's just been 2 years. But I think there is this sense, the job is kind of done and we can move on. Because visibly we now have also more people of color in positions of power in the UK. So yes, I do think it's heading in the right direction. But maybe not enough of a systemic shift yet. But I think the next generation is different. I mean, there are people like us, kind of leaders already in our own right, but maybe coming up to leading bigger organizations or bigger initiatives as we move on, become older, essentially.
Yeah.
And then you do have young people these days who care so much about diversity and inclusion, who I think are not happy with the status quo. So I do think, given a few more years, there will be more pressure again, bottom up, for this to be fully integrated into all organizations, non-profits or for-profit. So by way of that, funders would have to do a bit more and channeling more funds. And also as diverse communities gain more wealth, that then they would kind of mirror and, give more funding to people who look like them as well. So that's, I do think in the longer term, it will, we're heading the right direction.
I hope so. And I think it will, of course, take continuous pressure on every generation, like the new generation and next generation, current generation watching this can kind of see their responsibility as well, because nothing can be taken for granted and you need that consistent push. Thinking about people who might want to follow in your footsteps of being a social entrepreneur, like how do you start? Where do you start? Someone might have seen an issue, they might have seen a problem they're really angry about and want to do something about it. And they might think, okay, I want to become a campaigner. I want to become an activist. Actually, maybe I'll be a social entrepreneur. Can you kind of outline the steps very practically as to what one should do and consider if taking the pathway of a social entrepreneur?
I think my guiding question has always been, where can I have the most impact?
Okay.
I think during school, after I kind of done a lot of volunteering, I think I kind of got this sense I really want to contribute to society, and I'm angry at so many social injustices. So that I went on. I don't think I was consciously doing it, but looking back and joining the dots, I was testing different things. So I actually did so many different internships. My husband was looking at my LinkedIn profile yesterday and he saw like 16 experience. He's like, wow, so many. And I should probably delete some of the things I did as an intern, but I was an intern in a marketing department of like a fast moving consumer goods kind of company. I also was in a bank. I worked in a bank, and I worked in a think tank and in the government. And basically I did all these things at private sector, public sector, non-profit sector. I also worked as a campaigner. And then I realized none of these were satisfying me fully. And you have to understand a bit about your own personality, what makes you tick, what kind of environment you thrive in, where do you feel you can be the best self. And I think I just landed in social entrepreneurship because I felt there's the social impact, that's the purpose. And entrepreneurship is about making things happen quickly, thinking about where you could also become sustainable. And I think there was just a bit of that drawing me in because I didn't want to be, I believe a lot in like self-sufficiency. It might be the indoctrination from my grandmother. She always said, you should be self-sufficient and like don't rely on handouts or benefits. And my mom always also tell me you have to be independent, don't rely on the men and blah blah. So anyway, there's a bit of indoctrination that I think I then felt, I want to work on something where I don't have to rely on one source of funding. So I was more attracted to the social enterprise model as opposed to non-profit model. I still think there's a really important place for nonprofits, for campaigner working, maybe for think tanks working more on system change, but that change is very long and you have to be very focused. I think for me, it was more the dynamism of entrepreneurship where you can do something, test it, get response from the market, and then move on. That appealed to me. And I do believe, despite my criticism of capitalism, which I said earlier, growing up in Hong Kong in a very hyper-capitalist society, I still think the market mechanisms do make things happen quicker, do let you get to scale quicker. And the impatience in me, therefore, has led me to be drawn to this world of social enterprise. But I think you have to start with what you want to do, not who you want to be.
What you do. Okay.
And I think what you want to do needs to be linked at what's the change you want to create. I do worry with this kind of branding of social entrepreneurship. When I was starting as a social entrepreneur, I don't think I knew it was going to be cool or that, you can travel to so many places.
Yeah.
It just became this lifestyle thing, right? And we're both on the Forbes 30 under 30. I didn't know. And I don't think I was attracted to any of that. And I think I was just really thinking, well, there's this social issue, gender equality that I care a lot about. I have this idea. Can I just make something happen? And I didn't know I would become a social entrepreneur. I think I just wanted to do something.
And you have done so much. I mean, I'm very curious to then thinking about you in that kind of midway point of your journey. Like, do you have like a sense of a list of the first 5 things you practically did? Did you write a plan? Did you go and speak to your mentor? Did you analyze the markets? Did you research different papers? Very practically speaking, in almost like a step-by-step way, how did you go about what you did?
So once I did kind of decide to be a social entrepreneur, even though it was less like a decision point, but more as things go on. But the first step was I started a Facebook page, which is you need a front to communicate what you're trying to do.
Okay.
So that then the second step is then I invited friends to like it.
Interesting. So the shop could be anything. It could be like on your doorstep. It could be in your neighborhood. It could be in your workplace. It could be in your school.
Anything. But just succinctly communicating what is it that you're trying to do.
Okay.
And then you invite people, right? You need to build a community. It might not be a movement per se, but at least you need a community. You need people who are like-minded, who believe in your vision. And then you need ways to get them involved.
Okay.
Liking is very passive. We always, I study a bit like kind of activism in the online space, and you could have this slacktivism moment, right, where people like something and think they've done something. So you need to think of a way for your supporters who are liking what you do now, but to get involved. So you need to define roles and responsibilities. What is it that you want to do? And that's when I created, I have a programs team, I have a business development team, I have a marketing team, and everyone has different responsibilities and their tasks, and that they need to, be accountable to each other and start making things happen. So
understanding the makeup of an organization and what's needed, and then trying to fill that the gaps which are needed, and almost looking at the community of people and saying, what do people want to get involved with? I mean, that I'd love, as a near final question, because I'm aware our time is running out, I'd love to talk a bit about the culture you're building now. But before we do so that's almost like the first step. First step, create like a front and definition. Second step, invite people. Third, figure out what needs to be done and organize folk. What would you say was the next step?
Then I think for social change, you have to really test your theory of change. I mean, your theory of change may be in your mind, but you must have some idea on why you think what you do will lead to that social impact. So you really need to keep testing it.
Okay.
So
how do you test?
We did workshops, like our whole idea was to train women in photography. So we did a lot of photography workshops, and then we got feedback from our students. What do they think worked well, what not? And then we actually got them to train, because they, with lived experience, that's the most effective in then creating change. So you have to really keep testing what you're doing and whether it has impact. And I think the final thing is you do need a plan on how you can sustain it. And
Yes.
sustaining is not, people just think about sustaining from a finance perspective, and that's part of it. You have to think, well, of course, it takes money to put things together and blah, blah. So you do have to think about financing. But I think it's also how do you sustain the momentum and the energy of the people that you're bringing in.
Okay.
And that requires you to think about the culture that you're building for that organization and making sure that people continue to be motivated. So, yeah, so I would say those are like the 5 things.
That's really helpful. I'm just, it's 10 past now. Are you okay for 5 more
Yeah,
minutes?
fine. Yeah.
Okay. Um, let's talk as the final bit here about those 2 things because they really lean on the kinds of skills one needs to be a leader. First off, the money part and financial sustainability. Now, for myself as a social entrepreneur running the School of Social Justice, one of my top priorities is always how do I ensure we bring in income and revenue in order for us to, pay for the cameras, pay for the studio and office and all of the bills we need to pay for our software and our team and our accountants and all that kind of stuff. And it's a very particular skill in itself. I'm curious to know how you see how you kind of like sustain your organization financially. And then later on, I'd love to talk about culture. But first off, how about a question on how do organizations and people who want to be social entrepreneurs look at financial sustainability?
And so for the nonprofit I started, I think testing different models, you can have earned income, and if earned income, you have to be really clear who you're selling and, again, testing that. But I think what we've decided on is more a grant-based model because there are funders who are interested in the impact you're creating, who are willing to pay for it, and that's completely fine. You just need to make sure you have a diversity of funders. But for the for-profit consultancy that I'm now running, the thinking about financial sustainability is much more about really understanding our customers, understanding our revenue drivers, our profit margins, and thinking of ways that we can maximize profits. But when I say that, it sounds like crude, but actually profits is aligned with our impact, right? And the more margins we have in what we do, the more room we can have to actually use those profits to fund things and do things that currently the market is not paying us for.
So in a very practical example, you might have a service you provide to a business, whether it be workshops or advisory work, and then you sell that to them at a price. Obviously, there's a certain amount it costs to deliver that service, and the amount extra is the profit you make, and then you reinvest that, or you might use it for other means to achieve the impact you seek to achieve.
And I think it's being really clear about your business model and thinking of ways that you can basically make more money with fewer resources. So I was, I think, fortunate enough to study business and like some of those thinking, probably accounting was the most useful course because you just have to be really clear what's your revenue, what's your costs, and being able to succinctly articulate that.
There you go. I mean, we've not heard that at the School of Social Justice, but I think that's exactly it. To be an entrepreneur, you need to get your numbers right, and maybe we should try and figure out doing a course on accounting.
Yes. Well, my mother, she doesn't speak English very well, but she is an accountant. So
okay, we can
I think that
get some translators as well.
I think that thinking helped me, always just bear in mind, actually, there you have to be so clear about your own numbers, because that's the basis for financial sustainability.
That's great. And finally, a bit about culture. You talked about how your organization is flourishing, it's growing. You have 20 staff members across continents. How are you approaching this very particular challenge of growth?
Growth is very difficult because I still sway between should I grow or not, right? In our world, talking about moving the whole economy to more regenerative economy, and the idea of like donut economics. I'm sure some of your other guests might talk about it. There's this idea of degrowth that organizations shouldn't need to grow because we actually have all we need, and that is more about redistribution. Um, but I think in my company, because what we're offering around social impact is very much needed by the market, we do see ourselves growing. But growing does mean there's a lot of pressure on the team.
Okay.
There's a lot of growing pains. And team members might feel a bit more isolated because the team is grown and, you know, some of the tight-knit culture is no longer there. So you have to invest a lot in the processes to bind everyone together, but also give enough time to re-establish the culture for the whole organization. And it's things that I don't oftentimes feel I'm very good at doing.
Okay.
But I think back to my earlier point around stepping out of your comfort zone, I often just remind myself, maybe that's a challenge for me to be a better leader. And internally, I mean, we talk because we advise clients on equity and inclusion, so we have to be inclusive ourselves. And we do set up a lot of internal processes for staff to air their concerns and what they don't feel happy with. And some of them are really difficult for me as a leader. I take feedback very personally, and that's something I'm still working on. But yeah, I do have to let go of my ego and just, okay, you know, they're saying things that might be hurtful for me because I feel, are they blaming me? But actually, I need to let that go and just see, well, what can I do constructively and how can I improve on the culture? So it's a work in progress. Because there's not like this recipe on how to be a great leader. Everyone needs to figure out their own way.
Yes, and what a wonderful way to end, in the sense that everyone watching is figuring out their own way. But I think with the kind of enlightenment you've shared of your own experience, people can, I'm sure, like myself, glean so much wisdom, which then they can take with them in figuring out their own leadership journeys in addressing matters related to social justice. Bonnie, thank you so much for joining us here. It's been a pleasure. I've been really looking forward to this one, and clearly the last hour is testament as to why. So much there, and I wish we could talk more, but we can't. So maybe in the next season we can talk more. Before we end, do you have any final words for the students of the School of Social Justice?
My final words is just follow your own heart. It's just so cheesy, but I think as a young person, you can get swayed by what your friends or what your family says you should do. And actually, we just need to trust ourselves, trust our inner voice, and that will guide us to the final destination of where we should be.
Wonderful. Bonnie, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Cheers.
Yeah.
This educational content is absolutely free. Why? Because our vision is a world where anybody, no matter their background, can learn how to make a difference. To keep going, we need your help. Can you become our next patron? Can you help us reach 2,500 patrons? I really hope so. Whatever the case, hope you learned something today, and sending you peace and love. Let's keep learning.